Hello and welcome to another A-Level History Russian Revolution revision session. Today we're going to be considering what was the main cause of the February 1917 revolution. You're most likely to be asked a question where they give you a particular factor and say, was this the main cause, or do you agree this was the main cause? So you need to think about the relative importance of factors in particular in that sort of a question. Just my top tip for today in general for revision, when you revise, revise again and again and again and again and again and again and again until it's so easy you could teach it to someone else. It's not just covering the topic once and reading it once. And vise, looking at stuff, isn't actually enough. So this is a little bit misleading. Look at your notes and textbooks and Sam Learning and Doddle and all the resources you have access to, and then actively revise. So you might not know, but it's a statistic that's come up with it, and you can Google it. About 10% of what you read you'll probably remember, maybe 30% of what you see, 50% of what you see and hear. So you'll only remember 50% of what's in this video. So to get yourself top marks in the exam, try more active revision than just watching and listening. You remember 70% of what you discuss, so go and tell someone about what you've learned today. Teach them about a topic. You remember 90% of what you teach to others, so you would be best off teaching a friend who maybe is also doing the exam, or teaching the wall or your cat or your chair. It doesn't really matter if the object you're teaching doesn't listen to you, but teach them about what you've learned today. Teach them how to answer the question even better. Teach them how to go about answering this essay question. What should they do first? What should they do next? What do they need to do to get top marks? If you're doing that, you're actively revising and doing something again and again and again until it's so easy you could teach it to someone else. That's when you're going to get yourself that A grade at A level. So make things happen, revise. So we're going to look now at the causes of the February 1917 revolution, not to be confused with the October revolution. So this is the abdication of the Tsar, the end of the Romanov Dynasty that we're talking about here. So there are many different causes. One could be the Tsar's political mistakes, or political mistakes in general. It could be loss of military support, which I would potentially combine with World War I. Rasputin. It could be the lack of political change. Sometimes you might be asked about the Tsarina herself. So we're going to look at these different factors, and we're considering what the main cause was of the abdication of the Tsar, or the 1917 revolution. So let's have a look first of all at one of the most important factors leading to the 1917 revolution and the abdication of the Tsar ultimately. This is World War I. And it's what Michael Lynch, he's got a fantastic book if you're looking for a book to revise from as well. He says that potentially one of the main reasons for the February 1917 revolution is the length of World War I, and that maybe if the war had been short, like the Russo-Japanese War had been in 1905 and like previous wars had been, that actually the Tsar might have survived, and it was more to do with the fact that the war was so long. It led to a huge amount of spending, so about 17 million rubles were spent on World War I between 1914 and 1917, which obviously led to an increase in tax. That meant that goods cost a lot more, so there's about 200% inflation in this period. Just in 1914, 4 million men were killed, 15 million men were taken from the countryside by 1917, and 36.7 million men were conscripted by 1917. So all of these things caused the 1917 revolution because it means that there's social unrest, people can't afford goods and food. It means that there's a lack of food being made. If all the men are being taken from the countryside where they're agricultural workers, creating things, farming, and they're being used in the army instead, then there's not enough food being created. And when people are not being fed enough and their social conditions are bad, they're more likely to revolt and rebel. They also had to requisition, which means kind of basically take from, farm horses to use in the armies, and things like fertilisers as well, which were used in the production of ammunitions. And more than just these kind of this creation of social unrest, the army was fed before the cities, so that meant that the food that there was given to the army and not to the people in the cities. So you've also got groups of people in cities, so all kind of very close together. You've got industrial workers who were sometimes literate, and they're now starving because there's not enough food. The army were also using the transportation systems like the Trans-Siberian Railway, and they had priority, obviously, for military reasons. However, it wasn't well organised, so supplies supplies were overlooked in the transport of goods, and it was all focused on the army, and therefore supplies were sinking into the ground at places like Archangel, even though there were soldiers going without munitions and guns and uniforms and things like that. They had millions and millions of these things, but they weren't actually getting to the soldiers because they hadn't organised how they were going to transport the goods. So the goods were just rotting away in places like Archangel, whilst the soldiers were going without ammunition that they actually had within Russia. So this is maybe more bad planning than anything else, but World War I was definitely a factor in causing the revolution, because the bad planning of how they were going to transport things across the country, and perhaps the over-prioritisation of the army, meant that not only were ordinary industrial workers and peasants unhappy at conditions, so was the army, and they lost the support of the army. Again, other reasons why they lost the support of the army: loss of battles. So, for example, in the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, 30,000 men were killed and injured. They were driven out of Poland in December 1915. The Brusilov offensive was a failure as well. So all of these things point to the fact that World War I was also not doing the Tsar any favours and creating any kind of patriotic loyalty, but in actual fact that they were losing the war, and therefore the Tsar wasn't getting that kind of support from his country either. So bad social conditions, loss of support of the army, and lack of food and starvation, which made it the sort of the catalyst, the environment in which it was possible for a revolution to happen. And according to Michael Lynch, potentially the most important cause of the February 1917 revolution. We've already mentioned World War I and the fact that he lost the support of the army. I guess something just to add to that, really. Loss of the military support. There were desertions because of the poor organisation, lack of ammunition and uniforms and things, particularly in December 1916. So just something to add to your World War I paragraph. Okay, so let's have a look now at the Tsar's mistakes, or political mistakes, as a cause of the 1917 revolution. Was it the main reason or not? Well, let's have a look. So obviously a particularly notable mistake that the Tsar made, Tsar Nicholas II, of course we were talking about, is he made himself Commander-in-Chief of the army in September 14. There we are, deliberate mistake for you. Okay, so Commander-in-Chief of the army in September 1914. So that made him directly responsible for battle losses, and he did it after the losses of Tannenberg, where 30,000 men were killed and injured. So it seemed perhaps to him like a good idea that his uncle, who was the current Commander-in-Chief, wasn't doing a good enough job. However, the Tsar lacked any real military experience, so he wasn't necessarily in the position to make the best military tactical decisions. And it also made him directly responsible for any battle losses from that point onwards. So people would blame him and not someone else. Okay, but that's not the only mistake. Obviously, we've already mentioned briefly the Progressive Bloc. The Tsar ignored Duma's appeal to him to replace the cabinet, and they pressured the Tsar to change things, but he ignored them. So he wasn't really working with the political forces that were there. Perhaps an even better example of the Tsar's mistakes in politics, and that highlighted his political incompetence, was the Zemgor, which was created to help the war effort, in particular to help the casualties of war and their families. but it increasingly showed how bad the Tsar was at organising any help for these groups of people. In fact, he really didn't get involved. And although it was formed to help the war effort, it led to increasing opposition of the Tsar because it proved that there was a workable alternative to the Tsar. Zemgor wasn't run by the Tsar at all. He didn't even attempt to set up his own version of the Zemgor to help the relief of casualties of war. So it proved that people could run the country effectively without the Tsar's help. Again, another example of that would be the success of the Union of Zemstva, which formed to help people during the war effort, and it highlighted the incompetence of the Tsar. That's not, unfortunately for the Tsar, the only mistakes in political actions that he made. He left the Tsarina in charge of the country when he left to become the commander-in-chief of the army. This meant that there was a poor government. The Tsarina was no better equipped to run the country than the Tsar himself had been, and she was heavily influenced by Rasputin, as she relied on him for the care of her haemophiliac son because she believed he had some kind of healing powers. Theoretically, in 1912, he managed to somehow cure her son of bleeding to death by sending a telegram. Anyhow, that's a little bit of a tangent there. So the Tsarina was over-reliant on him, and it made it look like the Tsarist system was corrupt, and it was difficult to defend a system where someone with basically no qualification and no real support from either from Tsarist supporters or from the rest of the country, Rasputin, ends up having such a huge influence. So it made it much more likely that people would support the abdication of the Tsar. They think that he's not capable of running the country, other people are doing a better job. He's not even present at the time of crisis, and he's actually doing things that are going wrong. He's ignoring the suggestions of the Progressive Bloc, the Zemstva, the Zemgor, and he leaves the wrong people in charge. So it makes it highly likely that he has to abdicate and that there's a revolution by 1917 in February. But arguably, we've briefly mentioned him, but definitely a key reason why there's a revolution in 1917 is Rasputin himself. He's a self-ordained holy man, or was rather, and was also notorious for sexual excesses, and his behaviour was seen as very unbecoming and damaged the reputation of the dynasty, the Romanov dynasty, as they were being sort of tarred with the same brush as Rasputin. Rumours spread about his sexual encounters with both the Tsarina and her daughters, which did no favours for them. And it gave a focus of hatred for the Tsarist system. People had something to focus their dislike on. It was so bad that they had to censor the press, so that stories weren't necessarily escaping about this. It also led to jealousy of previous senior ministers like Stolypin, so it split the previous support for the Tsar, as they didn't like the fact that this man with no real experience or qualities seemed to be taking their place in running the country, and so it also divided the supporters of the Tsar. The Tsarina relied on Rasputin for the care of her son, and this increased opposition against her, basically. So it led to people being more likely to making the accusations that they did, that she was German and therefore she was a spy, she was working against the Russian war effort. So it made Rasputin's presence made the kind of xenophobia against having a German wife and the hatred of the Tsarist system much more likely. We've mentioned previously, but it's very difficult to defend a Tsarist system when it's so easily taken over by a corrupt man. Rasputin had no real training. There was a constant changing of ministers, sometimes referred to as leapfrog changing of ministers during a time of crisis for Russia, because they didn't really know how to run the country. So we've looked at the main reasons, or the causes rather, of the February 1917 revolution and the abdication of the Tsar. Now consider which one of these do you think is the main cause of the February 1917 revolution. Frequently, World War One pops up as a reason, but it could also be the Tsar's political mistakes, perhaps even Rasputin, or lack of political change. You need to be able to justify why you think that's the main cause. And ideally, for an A-grade answer, you need to be saying why it's more important than other causes or less important than other causes as you go along through your essay. So your link sentences or at the end of your paragraphs and your conclusion and your introduction should mention what's the main cause, and links in particular. Make sure you're explaining why something is more or less important than the stated factor in the question. In your conclusion, fully explain why something is or isn't the main cause. So if it's asking you, was World War One the main cause of the 1917 revolution, you could say it was the main cause because although these other factors did X, Y, Z, ultimately World War One was the main factor because, or you could say, although World War One did this, that and the other, ultimately it wasn't the main cause because. Make sure you justify why you think it was or wasn't the main cause. Okay, good luck with your revision. Remember to revise actively, as I suggested at the beginning. Go and teach your cat or dog or fish or hamster or brother or sister or chair or tree about this topic. Good luck in your exam.